Welcome everyone to the second colloquium of the fall semester. And we're delighted and honored to have Dr. Jackie Murray. She is an associate professor of classics and African American and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky. She got her PhD in classics from the University of Washington, MA in classics from the University of Western Ontario, and a BA with a summa cum laude in Latin and classical studies from the University of Guelph. Her research interests are amazing: Greek and Latin literature, especially of the 3rd century BCE to 2nd century CE, ancient astronomy and archaeoastronomy, Hellenistic and Roman intellectual networks, race and the classics, the reception of classics in African American and Afro-Caribbean literature. She has numerous awards. I'll just mention that she's been a fellow and visiting scholar at the Center for Hellenic Studies, numerous publications, a very interesting body of work. She's working on 2 books, The Poetics of Controversy, Apollonius against his Argonautic predecessors for Harvard University Press, and another, Read in the Stars, Poetry, Astronomy, and the Construction of the Ptolemaic Sky in the Reign of Ptolemy III and Berenike II. She has some very interesting international activities as co-director of the University of Kentucky faculty and led study abroad program, Greeks in Italy. She did a program of Western classical and medieval culture for the Fujian Catholic University in Taipei, Taiwan, and good old Roman topography for the University of Washington. Her professional credentials are wonderful also. She is currently co-president of EOS, the Africana Receptions of Ancient Greece and Rome, and Society for Classical Studies Committee on Diversity in the Profession, the American Classical League's Diversity Task Force. But she's also served in such positions as an associate editor for Brill Research Perspectives in Classical Poetry, and she's been on the editorial board of Classical Philology. So please join me in welcoming our guest who will speak on Racecraft in the Odyssey and Argonautica. Professor Murray.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. Almost forgot some of the stuff there that I've been doing. And I really want to thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to share what will probably be a 3rd book on the topic, and might divert the astronomy one that you're mentioning. It's getting pushed off further away because this one seems more interesting than that one. But yeah, so I'm going to talk about how we can talk about race in literature. So I'm a literature person, so as opposed to historian. So I'm going to look at the way literature uses or can construct race in the ancient world. So, as I said, this discussion is going to be part of a larger idea about racecraft in epic in general. So I'm going to share my screen here because I have a PowerPoint that might spice things up. Where's the PowerPoint here? Okay, and then we need the slideshow. Play from the start. Okay, so it won't cause any trouble. Okay, yeah. So I'm just going to start by reading. So this discussion is part of a larger study of ancient epic that is going to approach. First of all, to establish that there is race in ancient epic, and it's going to look at it from the perspective of race in the ancient Greek and Roman context, using critical race theory, and I'll go into that a little bit as I discuss it. And it's going to explore what ancient racism looked like, and how it was reproduced, justified, and made to seem natural through epic storytelling. And today I'm going to focus specifically on how that happens with some examples from the Odyssey and the Argonautica. And as the most privileged genre, epic had a widespread cultural authority and influence among all Greek societies. I've been saying to date as well. And the epic tradition, which privileges, hold on a second, I think I lost it. Yeah, no. The epic tradition, which privileges Homer and Hesiod, bequeathed to subsequent poets more than just the language, the meter, the stories. It also left them a racial power structure and literary techniques to reproduce, sustain, and justify the dominion of the heroes, and by association, their alleged real life descendants, um, over the people they oppressed and the people that they're associated with in the real life context. So this is obviously going to be asserting that there is, at least on the political level for epic, there can be this allegorical reading, and that's already early on, I think. So as stories that glorify the achievements of the mythical ancestors of the ruling elites in societies that received these epics, they present the power dynamic between heroes and subaltern groups in the epic world as a lieu de mémoire for the specific articulation of racism at the moment of reception. In other words, by reference to a construction of the past that is linked to the present, epic storytelling explains tendentiously from the perspective of the hegemonic group to the society at large, for which it's considered culturally important, why hierarchies the hierarchies that operate in the society are the way they are, and more importantly, why they need to stay that way. Um, and because epic centers the heroic perspective, the oppression that's experienced by the subaltern groups in the story is often cloaked and often made to seem reasonable and justified. And this is why you might be surprised. You never thought of that before. When I go through what it is. So if you haven't noticed race in the Odyssey before, don't worry. I'm going to reveal it. Okay. Um, so, uh, however, the hero as such can really only exist where there is the possibility of degradation. Like you can't have a hero in a world where nobody can be degraded or dehumanized. You need both. Epics then reflect a racial hierarchy that persisted through time in the ancient Greek communities that received the poems, a racial hierarchy where seafaring, city-dwelling peoples, that the heroes, that is, were constantly at war with herding nomadic peoples. And in the ancient world, you do have this dichotomy all over the ancient world between the folks who live in a city urban setting and those who are nomadic groups. They're often at war with each other. And so what epic tends to do is associate the nomadic folks with the folks who end up enslaved, and in the case of the men are often made to herd the flocks that are connected to the city, right? And in order to maintain that kind of caste/race system and keep the folks that are hurting in their place, race is then deployed. So what epic does is it obscures and justifies this through storytelling. And so epic simultaneously, I'm going to argue, casts a spell, as it were, that collectively ratifies both the inalienable humanity of the heroes and those in the real world who they're associated with, and at the same time also creates this alienated humanity for the groups that are oppressed and enslaved by the heroes through monstrification, association with monsters, and so that's the basic idea. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about how this works in the Odyssey, Homer, and Apollonius the Argonautica, and so I've divided this up into four sections, right? So the first section, I'm gonna make an argument for a trans-historical description of race. So a description of race that can transcend time. And then second section, I'm going to talk about racecraft, I'll explain what that is. And then I'll talk about authoritative storytelling and how, like, give an example of authoritative storytelling that we can understand, i.e. film, and show how racecraft is working in that. And then in the third section, I'm going to give you some examples from the Odyssey. And then in the last section, I'll talk about the Argonautica. Okay, so that's how the talk's going to break down. Okay, all right. So let's talk about this historical description of race. So Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, famously observed that the modern construction of race is based primarily on skin color. And this is not at all unfamiliar to us, right? So here is his famous line from the Souls of Black Folk. Herein lie buried many things, which if read with patience, may show the strange meaning of being Black here in the dawning of the 20th century. This meaning is not without interest to you, gentle reader, for the trouble of the 20th century is the problem. So the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, and we could say the 21st century as well. So I'm just going to move things around here. So there's a growing recognition, however, in terms of studying classics and looking at the ancient world, that the ancient Greeks and Romans did not consider themselves, or would not have considered themselves, to be a white race. Okay, despite the current opposite arguments that are made by white supremacists, right? So this is a historical, it's a historical fact, right? That today's skin color based racial categories were created in the 15th century to justify the permanent enslavement of Africans. So prior to that moment in history, a widely accepted argument for designating a specific group of people as subhuman based on physical characteristics had yet to be perfected. So we hadn't yet thought about physical characteristics being as important. So even Aristotle, whom we catch in the act in politics, actually arguing for a Helleno-supremacist racial hierarchy that he's sort of basing actually on gender. He doesn't think to base his natural slaves concept on physical characteristics, so not on skin color any more than on head shape. So it's not something that seems to him to be a reasonable thing to use to identify race with, even though he is looking for something as differentiating as male and female gender, right? So white supremacy, anti-blackness didn't really exist in until slavery was seriously challenged on moral and intellectual grounds by powerful members of the dominant group, the European elites, who stood to benefit from the economic and political environment that would emerge in a slavery-free global economy. That's important, I think, to think about, that there are people who wanted slavery because it would benefit them, and there are folks who didn't want slavery because it would benefit them, right? And sure, there are people who want it for moral reasons, but the moral reasons had to align with the real tangible power and economic reasons. So once people are powerful enough to make argument, or powerful people want to make arguments about anti-slavery, that's when it becomes an issue, and consequently justifications need to be made. And so the arguments then start to be made that Black people are not human, or definitely not as human as white people. And so this justifies their enslavement. So Blackness then doesn't have the same racial valence in antiquity that it did, that it does today, right? and that's really, really crucial. And so, unlike what Du Bois is saying here, the problem of the 8th century or the 3rd century BCE is not the color. It's the problem of the color line. But just because racism as we know it and how it's manifested, or at least how it's defined, doesn't exist, or we can't seem to find it in the ancient world, doesn't mean that they didn't have their own kind of racism. So since their group-based social hierarchies are a feature of most societies, then it's far more likely that the ancient Greeks and Romans simply just constructed their racial dynamics differently under different criteria. So I'm gonna go to the next slide here. Make it the next slide. Okay, yeah. All right, so I'm going to just give you some definitions that I'm working with that come out of critical race theory. So the first thing is the ontological or logical priority of racism to race. So often the idea is that the misconception is that racial categories or physical difference in our case, recognizing these things, this creates racism, right? And so the argument that, well, people who are constantly noticing people's skin color are racist, right? That's not necessarily the case, right? So recognizing and acknowledging a physical differences is not prior to racism. Racism is prior. So the ideology then, racism is the ideology, the shouldness. I call ideologies like the way things should be. So I call it the shouldness. So the ideology that legitimates the desire or the need for the group with power in the society to impose their collective will on the other groups that they're going to oppress, exploit, conquer, exterminate, etc. Right? So they have a need to do that for whatever it's going to benefit them. And so then in order to justify it, in order to rally enough people around this particular way of thinking, racial categories are generated. Okay, so the racism, the ideology is going to determine, is determined in the historical moment too. So that's why we can have a different racial construction than folks in the 3rd century BCE, than people in 3rd century BCE might have to the Romans on the other side of the Ptolemies could have a different one than the Romans on the other side of the Mediterranean, etc. So it's historically and locally contingent. It's forces within the society that help them tweak the categories, right? And so this racism is going to determine the categories, the direction of oppression, and the systems that the society is going to institute to police the boundaries of these categories and the maintaining this dynamic. And so one of the mechanisms that are used is storytelling, is what I'm going to argue here. Okay, so but the number one and most important aspect of race you have to have race is power dynamic of oppression, like the dominant group. And it can't just be someone who's just physically strong. It has to be that person plus the society, where if things were switched, they would be treated completely differently. Right. So we can think about, like right now, the Black Lives Matter movement, right? In terms of how, say, the guy from Kenosha, who was how he was treated, despite the fact that he crossed state lines and started shooting people willy-nilly. He's treated completely differently than Breonna Taylor, who is just sleeping in her bed, minding her own business, right? So this kind of thing, if you're in the dominant group, you have a completely different set or relationship to the power structures of the society, and so versus the oppressed person, the racialized person has a completely different relationship with the same institutions that are supposed to guarantee or sort of organize freedoms and et cetera in the society. All right, so power is really crucial. So you don't have race without power, okay? A power dynamic. And so so racial categories then for groups of people are constructed on historically contingent criteria, and it's imposed by the dominant group and the structures of the dominant group society on the other group. And it's also they're the ones that establish and maintain and naturalize it on the other groups. Okay, so if that's the way we're defining race, then you can hopefully see that we can export this idea into the ancient world and see it operating very similarly as and recognize it as race once if we recognize this. So another aspect of race is, well, which I'm going to touch on in looking at the two epics, is the difference between ethnicity and race, right? So one way of talking about ethnicity is in terms of just seeing it in isolation of the power political dynamic, where you can say, okay, each particular ethnic group is defining themselves by genealogical whatever's, geographical location, whatever it is that each group is doing individually as a group is self-identifying. That is one way of looking at ethnicity here. However, I'm not denying that that's a possibility or even incompatible, but ethnicities don't exist independent of a hierarchy, right? And also in this construction, they don't exist independent of race, right? And so what Professor Adolph Reed Jr. Points out in his essay on race, when he's asked the question about, well, how do you define the difference between race and ethnicity? And he says, well, actually, if you think about it, he says, I said that race and ethnicity are simply categories of social hierarchy. They're labels for different magnitudes of difference from the most desirable status on the continuum of okayness, and farther out a population is on the continuum, the more likely it will be seen as a racial group. And if it's somewhat nearer, then it's more likely to be understood as an ethnicity. And so this is the model that I'm going to be using, this continuum of sameness or difference, the continuum of okayness that he calls it a continuum of okayness, right? And so here is how I imagine, I theorize it, or in my discussion. So basically, it's tendentious in the sense that it's coming from and the perspective of the dominant group. So the dominant group is determining by the fact that it has a hegemonic control over the cultural institutions, the legal institutions, the education, like everything is sort of geared toward them, like, and their interests, right? And so they're the ones that determine the relationship between themselves and other groups that are lower on the totem pole or in the hierarchy, right? And so, as Reed was saying, the closer to them, then they're more ethnically close, versus the further away, they're ethnically different. And then there's a point where you become a race. Like, so how oppression works for the ethnicity and then the race has to do with to the extent to which the dominant group perceives the humanity of these other groups, right? And so I talk about the dominant group being or claiming for itself inalienable humanity. And so any challenge to their humanity, i.e., someone murders my daughter, etc., then the force of the society's justice system, etc., is going to try to redress that because I have an inalienable humanity, right? Whereas if you're an ethnicity or a race, it's all contingent. So certainly if it's an ethnicity, it's contingent to how much they think you're like, the dominant group thinks you're like them. So assimilation is sort of being imposed upon some groups, where you're less likely to suffer the consequences if you are more like us. And then when it comes to the race, they are already alienated. And so the mechanisms in the society that should acknowledge or reinforce your identity, these mechanisms actually reinforce the opposite. And so again, the legal system is a good one for us to think about, where you can be murdered without consequence, or etc., right? And so you can see how all three work together, where ethnicities are sort of oppressed by being the potential to be alienated. So they're alienable, their humanity is alienable. The race has to exist with them because you need to have the example of what happens to you when you are alienated, and in order for this whole system to function, right? So that's the the continuum. Okay, so let's go forward. So, but how race is constructed, again, is not by, the categories are not given in the world, right? In reality, they are imposed by the normal functioning of the society. So here's Du Bois, who's sort of like the architect, really, of thinking about race and is as a cultural construction, the father of critical race theory. He says, look, what is a black man? Black man is a man who must, or person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia. So in 1915, that could be an Italian, right? So this is how the racial category works. Okay. Now, all right, so let's go on for the next bit. All right, so now I'm going to give you some examples from first, I'm going to talk about what Racecraft is, and then I'm going to give you some examples from film history. All right. So in the case of, so Racecraft, I'm taking, pretty much wholesale from Barbara and Karen Field's really, I think, seminal study of race, and in their book, Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life. And they compare it to witchcraft. So the logic that goes with witchcraft, that makes people who believe in witchcraft believe in it, is this in the face of contravening evidence or contradicting evidence, is the same way they see the same thing operating with racecraft, right? So so they refer to it as the collective alchemy by which reason converts bald-faced inventions into external and constraining facts of nature, capable of resisting individual doubt, right? And they also talk about it as this, complex system of beliefs that are generated various ways and means, right? But what underlying it is the idea that there's something unseen about the person that we can somehow get at by their physical features, and in the case of blackness, right? The blackness points to this unseen ontology of the person, and how. But what's really confirming that belief is actually how they're treated. So Black people are disproportionately treated, or disproportionately victims of COVID, let's say. The logic would tell you, oh, well, it's because they're Black, why they're victims of COVID. No, they're victims of COVID because the society has set it up so that they don't have access to this, that, and the other thing that would make it easier for them not to be victims of COVID, right? But the way it sets it up is to reinforce the idea that that it's Blackness that's causing the victimness. So that's the logic that they're getting at there with racecraft. So racecraft then, as a thing that we're going to look for in the Iliad and the Odyssey, is the ways in which the racial structure is justified and naturalized, made to seem, just like part of the woodwork, um, and and just what are the techniques that Homer and Apollonius use to do that? Okay, so how I was thinking about racecraft in storytelling, I have this like simple formula, right? We're going to look for monstrification. Which is the main difference between, say, class and race, is the fact that race monstrifies the group, whereas, I mean, they might be indistinguishable on the surface, but the main issue is that the folks that are in the race are not as human as the dominant group. So there's attempts to dehumanize them, and so monstrification is that happens, and then you see the double standards in the way they are treated in relation to the dominant group, right? So that's my formula for how we're going to go forward with that. But let's look at it in terms of the examples from what we can recognize without any problem, that there's racecraft happening. So here you have in 1914 the film Cabiria, Italian film about Carthage, featuring Carthage, ancient Rome, etc. It's a girl, Cabiria, gets abducted, and then she's carried off, and they at some point end up in Carthage, which is in Africa. That's another important thing. And so now 1914 is important because 1915 is the Birth of a Nation film that comes out, which of course is a major racecraft device in creating white supremacy in America. So those ideas are already sort of percolating. And also in terms of like the Italian identity is also coming into being at this point, because you have the unification of Italy and the attempt to construct Italian identity as white in this geopolitical world. So that's important. All right, so of course, picking a story set in ancient Rome and Carthage makes sense to Italians, right? In this world. So in the story, what they have is they end up in Carthage, and there's a Roman who has a slave. Shocker. That's not too problematic. But what's interesting is the choice that they make about the slave. They decide, without historical necessity, they choose to make the slave an African. Now, bear in mind that they're in Africa, and this is also the time period where Black actors don't exist. There are no Black actors. Black actors are not allowed. So all actors are white. And so that means that all the Carthaginians are white, despite being in Africa. So that's an issue. So that's one story that's being told by this film, is that, well, Carthage is white. Then you do have a slave, and the slave is Black, an African. So, and this is a constant repetition of like, if you're going to represent the ancient world and you're going to have Black people in it, they're slaves. That's their role, right? Or they can be gladiators or whatever. But initially, they're almost always in a slave position. So in this, we've got the slave. And of course, because we don't have any Black actors, or we won't allow any Black actors because of our racism, we're going to have a white actor play the Black actor, like the Black slave, in blackface, right? So there we are. Now we've got that. Now, and so the character is Makiste, and he plays, I mean, it's a minor character too. So slaves, he's going to be a minor character, but he's so attractive to the audience because he is a noble, heroic figure. He's strong and gentle and saving everybody. That everybody likes him, and as one sort of narrative in the Italian identity stream is claiming that he is the Roman hero, right? But then there's the other stream, is like, oh no, he can't be the Roman hero because he's Black, right? He can't be the Roman hero. And so what starts to happen as they're planning to have spin-offs based on Makiste, who he becomes like he's a precursor to all those Hercules movies where you have Hercules and the Moon Man and Hercules and the, like a billion Hercules movies from in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Well, he's the precursor to this in Makiste. We have lots of films on Makiste. And so, but before we can have this figure as the main character in his own story, we have to do something about his blackness. And so what they start off by having in the showings of Cabiria, they have the actor Bartolomeo Pagano go to the showings and show up as a white guy or show up in blackface and wipe it off, right? So that these good qualities that we see that are connected to the hero, the character, but Makiste, are sort of explained away by, well, the reason why he is so noble is because really deep down he's white, right? So that's the narrative of how we're going to get him acceptable to the wider audience. And then when we do get Makiste in his own film, we move forward in time. We put him in the 1900s, early 1900s, 1800s, 1900s. We make him white, Italian, right? Northern Italian. And then we have to have these scene where he plays in blackface, disguises himself in blackface as a black slave, and then washes it off. Okay, so just in case we didn't catch it, that Makiste was really white underneath in the Cabiria film, we're going to do it again here in the spin-off, right? So this is what I would call the film racecraft, right? Where we're explaining the way the world is and why it should stay that way, i.e., we don't have Black people being represented in any way that is noble. And if we do, we've got an explanation for that, right? That they're really white underneath. Okay. So, so this is Jacqueline Reich, who excellent article on the Makiste transformation, talks about how this happens, like that this whole process is part of Italian identity politics at the time, but it also works in the States as in the process of whitening Italians at the time, because Italians at this point are treated as Black and they're subjected to lynchings, etc. And so we're now whitening Italians through this process, right? Okay, so that's one. And then the really quick one is the not to be outdone, Cleopatra. Apparently we're waiting for a new one coming out, which is just as problematic as every Cleopatra film. But here, what's interesting is, again, the reason I pick it is because it's in Africa, again, Egypt, Africa, and the issue of what is the relationship between, race and Egypt is very fraught. But also the tendency in the Hollywood is to, of course, avoid Pharaonic Africa, Pharaonic Egypt rather, and focus on Ptolemaic Egypt. And it goes all the way back to Shakespeare, of course, which is during the slave trade period, right? We don't really want to know about ancient Egypt, the Pharaonic Egypt. We want to focus on Ptolemaic Egypt because we can have white actors then, because of course we think Greeks are white, and then we can also have reinforce the idea that of settler colonialism, right? Of like the white folks coming down and dominating the Black people of the colonial region. And so what you see in the Cleopatra then is her slaves, again, not necessarily historically necessary. Her slaves are all Black, right? And really dark as well. And then and all the conquered peoples are exotified Africans, right? So so reinforcing the idea that Blacks are conquered, Blacks are slaves in the ancient world, and this justifies how we treat them today, right? But now we can have Black actors. What's the interesting thing is now, because there has been a reformulation, recalibration due to the civil rights movement that's happening at the time, right? So we can have Black actors now in the film, but they're going to play these roles to reinforce the ideas, right? So even though it's a move that seems like a move that goes away from white supremacy by having Black actors, right? No, we're going to get them, but they're going to play the same role, and reinforce the argument. Okay, so that's the idea, examples of racecraft. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the examples in the Odyssey. So there's lots of different ways of approaching this, a lot of different examples that I had, but I want to start first with talking about how the monstrification works, because that's the crucial thing, and then give some examples of how it manifests in Odysseus's interactions with Eumaeus, who is a herder, right? And very nice figure in the story of the Odyssey. Okay, so what we're going to have is a monstrification, and the two aspects of double standards we're going to look at is centering, like how the narrative constantly centers the heroic experience of the oppression, and then also ritual deference, how the expectation that the herder person should submit or be obedient to the hero no matter what. All right, so monstrification. Well, with the how this works is the narrator, Homer, for just for I don't know, stipulating, not making any other statements other than that the narrator is Homer. He may not exist, but anyway. But the narrator reinforces this or sets up this idea that the herders are a racialized group. Now, I'm not going to prove that the herders are racist, because I think they are exploited, they're trafficked, they're enslaved, right, in the story. So we can already see just by how they're treated that yeah, they're a racialized group. But how it is actually justified and mystified and naturalized is this process of monstrification. So their alienated humanity is created or constructed through the association with the Cyclops, right? And the Lystrogonians, who are herding peoples. They don't have ships. And they also behave in bizarre ways. They're cannibals, right? So they're gigantic and these kinds of things. So Odysseus, so you've got two levels of storytelling happening. You've got Odysseus, who's going to tell, and then the narrator. So when Odysseus, in this context where he's telling to the Phaeacians, what's happening is, on the one hand, the Cyclopes and the Lystrogonians are being constructed as monsters, they're monstrified herders, while the Phaeacians, who are listening and who are like Greeks, because they have ships, they live in cities, they have Xenia, they're pretty much Greek-ish. They're being constructed as an ethnicity, that on the green light section I had on my scale, right? And so what you get is that Homer tells us that the Phaeacians, who, when they used to live next to the Cyclopes, right, they were being harassed. So they're sort of primed to hear Odysseus' story about the Cyclops, because they kind of get this vicarious revenge of hearing Odysseus get the biggest guy among the guys that they used to have a hard time with. So that tends to work. But Odysseus' story is also reinforces the sort of monstrification through this discourse of ethnography. So we can think of like Homer as the father of ethnography. Well, yeah, he is, through Odysseus. Odysseus uses all this language of telling us about the geography of the place and how it's good for this and good for that. And so it in his ethnography and metaphorical analogy, this sort of, what I say, transmogrifies their alienated humanity into this terrifying monstrosity. So you've made the people that we dominate into this gigantic monster, who are terrifying and who have to be punished because they eat my people, etc. They do all this stuff that's very bad. And then that works because it works in the Odyssey really well, because of course Odysseus doesn't his mate, his Arete as a hero is his metis, right? Which the Phaeacians like. And so the Cyclopes are BA heroes. Their excellence is their BA, their strength, their physical violence, right? And so yeah, this is not something that's prized as much in the Odyssey. And so the fact that the herders are given BA makes it actually terrifying for the heroes, right? Because they're physically stronger. And so Odysseus winning out through his intelligence gets sort of demystifies the nightmare, that scenario that, what would happen if herders actually tried to overthrow us, right? So this is the worst case scenario would be, what if they were like gigantic monsters like the Cyclops, right? But this image then works well when you get to as a way of like being that sort of mystical invisible ontology behind the herders, the actual herders who are just, like Eumaeus. That's you're a herder, you're really a monster. And that's how that opposition is made up. And so how we see it, how it's proof of the monstrification, is how they're then treated in the Odyssey. So when we see the real herders, when we move out of Odysseus' stories, and we get to Ithaca, and then we start to see how Odysseus interacts with his real herders, we start to recognize that they are being treated differently. They're slaves, okay, but there's like a whole setup going on where these double standards that work in the society operate. And so the two that I'm going to focus on, I said, were ritual deference and centering. So ritual deference then is the insistence that the racialized group must show obeisance or acknowledge the superiority of the other group through, expected ways. So you might say not being able to talk back to the police when they're stopping and frisking you in New York, right? You can't, because you risk the violence that would happen, right? So that's a kind of ritual deference. But if you go back to, say, Jim Crow era America, if a Black person passed a white person on the street, you would have to tip your hat or something, right? So that acknowledging that the hierarchy is part of the ritual deference, right? So now this works in the Odyssey, where the expectation of folks like Melanthius, that Melanthius should, when he meets Odysseus, who doesn't even look like a hero, right? When he meets Odysseus, Odysseus is disguised as a beggar. So they all look the same as far as that's concerned. But Odysseus is angered by the way in which he talks about Odysseus, the missing Odysseus, and also his attitude toward the present Odysseus, the one he sees in front of him. So somehow Melanthius is supposed to be a mind reader and able to recognize that this is actually Odysseus. But also what's not acknowledged is that as a herder in this society, he actually is under the threat of violence to obey the suitors, right? Like Odysseus has been missing for 20 years. The suitors are in his position, and moreover, there's 108. I think, I can't remember. It's 100 and something of suitors. So, really, you're expecting the herders to stick up for Odysseus? I don't think so, right? So there's an unreal expectation of obedience to Odysseus when there's it's unrealistic for them to do. And so then when Odysseus, I think, irrationally expects this Melanthius to showed ritual deference, and he doesn't, right? And then of course later when he also sides with the suitors, which again Odysseus is disguised as the beggar, so there's really no reason why Melanthius should. But he gets punished, violently by Odysseus for doing that, right? Now, of course, we're being told a story focalized from Odysseus, right? So we're sympathetic to Odysseus. So we then are not really interested in why Melanthius might be doing what he's doing, other than the way it's being explained to us, which is that he's disloyal, right? And but none of the constraints on him are explicit, because, well, that would make Odysseus look bad, right? So we don't want Odysseus to look bad. All right, so now, and then this brings me to centering. So the whole, well, it's epic. So of course, epic is going to center the hero. And in this case, the hero that's centered is Odysseus. And so even though the Eumaeus is actually a slave of Odysseus, right? He tends to deflect his experience of oppression off of Odysseus and onto the suitors sometimes, and Odysseus himself does not sort of have too much sympathy for Eumaeus, other than to say, "Oh, wow." So when Eumaeus talks about how he was abducted as a child, and he was abducted as a child and then sold into slavery and then bought by Odysseus's father, Odysseus says, "Oh, wow, you were really carried away as a child." And first thing there's basically, how did you get here, right? And one of the ways is he thinks that well, the two ways in which he engages, which is sacking cities and abducting people at their doing their herding. But then Eumaeus tells the other story where he was, carried off by his slave girl. But after hearing this story, he says, "Well, at the end of the day, Eumaeus, tell me more about your life." And he says, "Well, I've been suffering too, right?" And we know, of course, he has been, but he's a hero, so he can actually switch out of his code switch, as it were, out of his character, right? Um, and then another aspect is when he says, when Odysseus meets the dogs, right? Eumaeus, remembering Odysseus, but also thinks about saying, "Well, you could have been attacked by the dogs. I'm really worried about that," because Eumaeus is a nice guy in general. But what's interesting here is how he says that Odysseus, the other guys are, he says, my godlike king, I nourish his succulent sows for others to eat, right? As if he wouldn't have to nourish them for him to eat, Odysseus to eat. Like there's a complaining about the food, etc., that they're getting, that the herders are getting, but they wouldn't be changed much under Odysseus. But that's one thing. And then meanwhile, he longs for food, wandering over the countryside, alien of men, etc. So he's got his imagination of Odysseus as this someone like himself, right? But in fact, when Odysseus tells his story to him about who he is, Odysseus very studiously avoids saying that he was ever enslaved. He nearly was enslaved, but he never was enslaved. Even when he talks about the mother being a concubine, right? He makes sure that the father acknowledged who he was. So there's never a situation where Odysseus went from being a slave to being a hero, or he's a down and out hero for Eumaeus. And once Eumaeus recognized that he's a down and out hero, his attitude sort of shifts. And so when the question of the cloak comes in, and Odysseus asks for the cloak, and Eumaeus says, ask Telemachus to give you a cloak, and he'll give you lots of other things too. What's interesting there is that he's suggesting that Odysseus can wear different clothes, whereas in the Odyssey, that's all they have, right? The clothing that the Eumaeus and his guys have. But anyway, but the main issue is that all of the oppression that the folks like Eumaeus are experiencing is all filtered through the idea that it's right, it's justified, and deflected onto the suitors. The suitors are bad, and yeah, they are, no doubt. And there's lots of them, and so this makes it even worse. But what hides is the reality that it wouldn't be much different under Odysseus, ultimately, right? And that's hidden from our view. All right, and so let's see, yeah, here he is describing the suitors, and he says, he basically describes them as he says, in their hearts they take no thought of the gods or have pity. Well, the blessed gods don't like wicked deeds, but they reward just reward justice and men's righteous deeds. But even enemy foes, even they attack a foreign land. Zeus grants them the plunder. So here, attacking foreign lands, Zeus grants them the plunder, i.e., grabbing the people, and that, Zeus grants that. So that's already divinely justified. When they are filled up their ships and boarded home, even those guys, like even the pirates, right? They don't behave as badly as the suitors, and but of course Odysseus is the kind of pirate that he's comparing them to, so that adds to the irony here. All right, okay, so now I'm going to go to the Argonautica, and what's interesting is that Apollonius takes over the idea that the herders are a problem, or that they are a racialized group. And the first time we get this is, we're going to actually look at the two episodes, which is the Cyzicus episode and the Bithynian episode with the Micus. So in Cyzicus, we're told that the Argonauts arrive at this location where there are two sets of people living on the same island, and it's very much like the Cyclopes and the Phaeacians before they separated. And the one group is described here as they're hybristae, they're agrioi, they're earthborn monsters, gegenes, and they're a thauma to their neighbors, so they don't look normal. They've got these multiple arms, so calling in the 100-handers from Hesiod, and so they're terrifying to look at. So, and they're not called men. Race translates earthborn men, but actually aneres is not in the text, and that's really crucial because when he talks about the other guys, the Doliones, he does call them men. So and that's on the other side, the men, the Doliones, they dwelt on the other side. And so these guys are humans. He gives their genealogy, which he doesn't give for the Gegenes. The Gegenes are earthborn, so we must think monsters because all of Gaia's children are monsters, right? Whereas this guy is, he's got an ancestry, etc. And they're protected by Poseidon because they're his descendants. So they've got a divine ancestry. So they're heroic in the sense that heroes are supposed to be half gods. All right, and so the king comes out, meets them, entertains them, etc. And he tells them, you should stay on this side because it's safer, it's a better harbor, blah, blah, blah. And they do. And then when the king can't tell them more about what to see, what lies ahead of them on their way to Colchis, which suggests he doesn't have ships. There's ways in which Jim Clauses showed that both groups are identified with the Lystragonians. Certainly the Doliones are identified with the Lystragonians, but the Earthborn are identified with both Lystragonians and Cyclopes. So anyway, the Argonauts decide that they're going to climb up the mountain and look, and they move the ship, which is the problem. So they move the ship into the other harbor, which belongs to the other guys, the other people, and the Argonauts get into trouble there because the Gegenes then see the ship, see it as threatening. They come down and start throwing rocks at it and try to block it in. And then Hercules starts shooting at it, and then the narrator says, well, to be sure, these terrible monsters were raised by the goddess Hera, the legitimate wife of Zeus, as a labor for Hercules. So this is a labor of Hercules. So this attack that the Argonauts do against this this indigenous group is justified. It's divinely sent, which we don't really know because there's no actual labor like this. The narrator's just adding some stuff here. Okay, and so now what's interesting is what happens after they wipe out this group of people who live on the island. The narrator uses a simile where he compares the slaughter of the Gegenes to woodcutters. It says, as when woodcutters throw down long beams recently felled by their axes in line along the edge of the sea, so that by absorbing moisture they can receive the strong pegs. Thus, the arrows of the just the narrows of the Whitecap Harbor, they were laid out one after another, some in heaps, dipping their heads and chests in the salt water while they stretched their limbs out, and others conversely rested their heads on the sandy shore and their feet in the deep water. Both groups become the prey for birds and fish. And we can hear a sort of echo of the beginning of the Iliad, where it's birds and dogs to eat, right? Of this ill-treated bodies of the dead. So so on one hand, he's suggesting that they're going to be the resources of building a ship. And there's a compatible simile in the next episode, which is a shipbuilding simile that really goes together with this. So it could be that they could be building a ship, or it could be a shipwreck. But the point is that they are not treated as human. They're just logs. And they have the multiple arms to sort of help us out, thinking of them as like trees to begin with. So, yeah. Now, what's interesting is that they're not the only ones the Argonauts wipe out. So they wipe out the Gegenes, but the Argonauts also wipe out the Doliones, right? But how they do that is they leave and they get into a storm, so it's accidental. They come back and it's at night, and the Doliones see them coming to attack, and so they fight back, and the Argonauts slaughter everybody. And in the morning, they realize what they've done, and they're ashamed of what they've done, and they realize that it's irrevocable. And what they end up doing is they mourn the dead Doliones. They make a tomb for the king. They even have games. So you have these two sets of people that live on this island. The Argonauts wipe out both, and the narrator tells us, not like he tells us indirectly, but he tells us that later the Athenians are going to establish a colony there, right? And in the time period that Apollonius is writing, it's actually sort of like a Ptolemaic interest point of conquest, right? So the idea of wiping out the indigenous people before you come in and settle, or you claim that there's nobody here and you take over the island. Well, the Argonauts are in the stories of how that the colonization of Cyzicus works, is that they sort of laid the ground of the Greek colonization of that location. So here we see how Apollonius is interpreting it as, well, some people were not even human, so they were wiped out, and the others were accidentally wiped out, but justifying both. And so now, if we move to the last one I want to look at, is the episode with Amycus, who is a herder king, right? And so the Argonauts show up, and he's at his sheepfolds. We're explicitly told that this is the herder, but he's also a descendant of Poseidon. So we're conjuring all this Odysseus Poseidon thing happening. But he had this outrage, the narrator is hostile to him. He had these outrageous sort of immigration laws, basically saying that, you're going to have to box with me before you can enter the territory. And so Polydeuces, who's a boxer, he takes up the challenge. And as they're fighting, the narrator makes a simile again. And this time he says, he explicitly compares Amycus to Typhoeus, right? So we had Gegenes were hinted at that it could be Typhoeus, etc. Here now we have a herder explicitly connected to Typhoeus, and we know he's a human, right? Because he came out as a man, right? And he's in boxing is actually a very civilized thing to do, right? But yeah, he's being monstrified explicitly here through his association with Typhoeus. And then of course, it's directly opposed to how the simile that's used for Polydeuces, who's compared to the evening star, right? So Polydeuces is this beautiful evening star, whereas the other is Typhoeus. So, all right. And so now they kill, Polydeuces kills Amycus, and when the king is dead, then the other guys, his men, Amycus's men, attack the Argonauts, and so there's a fight. And the narrator then describes the Argonauts attacking the Bebrycians as like gray wolves attacking countless sheep. So the Argonauts are presented as anti-herder things, right? They're wolves, which are the enemies of herders. So, all right. And then as he's continuing in his simile virtuosity here, he then adds that when he gets them to, the Argonauts get them to flee, he says that yeah, and they were like shepherds or beekeepers, like, because he realizes he can't actually make the Argonauts shepherds, so he pulls back and says beekeepers who smoke out swarms of bees out of their nest, right? Again, the hesitation, or the sort of hesitation to use herders for the Argonauts, or shepherds for the Argonauts, is, I think, telling that Apollonius recognized that you can't call a hero a shepherd. That's not cool. And so so in general, then, this is how just some of the examples that make the Odyssey work. And so I just wanted to close with this statement by the recently passed David Graeber on the logic of identity is always and everywhere entangled in the logic of hierarchy. And it's only when certain people are placed above others, or where everyone is being ranked in relation to the king or the high priest or the founding fathers, that one begins to speak of people bound by their essential nature, like their hidden ontology, about fundamentally different kinds of human being. And that's what we're talking about, I think, when we're dealing with race in any context, much less moreover the ancient world. And so so what I've hopefully tried to show you is that the ways in which Homer and Apollonius have tried to reinforce ideas about nomadic people / herders as a different kind of person than the folks who live in the city, and how they do that is by aligning the dominant group in the real world to the heroes, and the racialized group to the herding, the cyclopes and herders, etc. All right, so that is all I wrote. So I'll stop sharing if I can figure out how to do that. And if we have time, I'll take questions. I hope it wasn't too fast. I tried to. Thanks for all that clapping. And there's a question here from Celestiana.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for that. I'm a Homerist, and I also am getting ready to teach a class on race and ethnicity in the ancient world.
Cool.
So this is all like very helpful for me to think about. I have like a comment and a question.
Sure.
So I found it very interesting how you were talking about how Melanthius is like never described as being under constraint by the suitors, even though undoubtedly he is. And I was thinking about how like Phemius, the bard, is like explicitly described by the narrator as like being forced to do it.
Right, exactly.
So like he is completely off the hook.
Yeah. Literally.
Yes.
Yeah, because that's what Telemachus says. He's off the hook, Dad.
Yes. Yeah, because of course the bard has to be treated well.
Right.
But I was also wondering if you have any thoughts about race in the Iliad.
Oh yes. Yeah. So the Iliad, I think, well, once we're in a war situation, we already are dealing with already racialized scenario. In order to get war going, you usually have this buildup of dehumanization on the other side. So they're already in this war. But I think what the fact is that they're fighting people that they see similar to themselves, right? So they're heroes fighting heroes. So the problem there is, well, I think it comes out in the issue of how are you going to treat the dead. That's why I think that the dead, honoring the dead is really a big theme in the poem, because how are you going to manage the dead of these other people who you've monstrified in order to fight them? How are you going to deal with that? And so in the case of when Achilles has Hector's body and he's completely, committing hubris, would say, against the body of Hector, he is acting or perpetuating the racializing of the Trojans in that, right? And the gods are offended by this, right? And so Homer there seems to be at some stage you have to pull back on that, like you can't have it, especially when they're perceived to be in the same category, right? So they're, we know that, yes, we racialize them in order to have this war, but they're really still us. So we can't perpetuate that even after the war, right? And so, yeah, so I think that's how it works, because yeah, I definitely think the way Hector is treated and the fear of that being happening to Patroclus and all the other, so it's built in, I think, in the idea of the hero, is that a hero can be, what makes you a hero is the ability to prevent yourself and your people from being enslaved, I think, ultimately what it does. And so because that you can't have that kind of heroic honor without the possibility of humiliation and degradation, that they have to be together. And so, yeah, so that I think that's absolutely there in that. And especially when the women are talking over Patroclus's body and they're weeping, you get these, I get the feeling, when I do it with my class, they're like, well, why is she even crying? Like, didn't he just kill all her family? Like, but yeah, she has to do the ritual deference of like, well, I mean, I'm a slave and he's this murderous guy. Better cry if he says cry. And you're told explicitly that the other women are crying, making it look like they're crying for Patroclus when they're really thinking about their lost family, their lost, parents, etc. Right? So yeah, I think it definitely works in there. But there, it's an issue of the two hero groups. At least Homer sees them as two hero groups, and then how the heroes are behaving. And I think it's a bit of a critique on that. So yeah, what do you, but I'm open to your opinion on it.
No, I love the comment about how the way the body is treated is very important, because it ties in so well with the example from the Argonautica, where the monsters get like dumped in the ocean and the Diliones get the honorable burial.
Yeah, and in fact, in Apollonius, in the third thing I didn't have time for, but in the third herders episode that I would have talked about is in the Libyan desert, right, where they're attacked by a herder who the narrator introduces with a heroic genealogy. He's the son of Apollo and blah, 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 descendant of Apollo, yada, yada, right? So he's set up as a hero. And one of the Argonauts tries to steal his cattle, and he comes back and kills the Argonaut. And then the Argonauts come back and kill him, right? And then we're only told that the Argonauts buried their guy, but not that the narrator doesn't want to even say that they didn't bury that guy. But so I get the impression that Apollonius, the narrator, by that point is a little bit hesitant to like continue on the monstrification, right? He's well, they buried him. It doesn't mention that, well, what happened to the other guy, right? And so that's yeah, I definitely think the way the body is treated is very important to how they recognize humanity in the war scenario. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have other thoughts, but I'll just send you an email. I don't want to dominate the question period.
Yeah. Any other questions?
If I may?
Sure.
First, thank you. It was a great paper. I really enjoyed hearing it. A lot of good ideas there. I want to compare that kind of approach to racism to the way the Greeks looked at others around
Right.
them. That
Right.
theory that if you're too far north, you're cold. If you're
Mhm.
the Persians, you're too effeminate. If you're down in Egypt,
Right.
you're too emotional. Do you see that meshing pretty well with your theories?
Well, I think well, I mean, I think, well, we see this in like the medical writers and, philosophical. I think they are trying to explain the different, human diversity, right? But what's missing in all of their, except for Aristotle and his natural slaves thing, what's missing tends to be the idea that they need to be conquered, or like in some of them, yeah, we're going to go after them and we're going to fight them, but the dynamic of the power dynamic isn't explicit in these discussions, and maybe it's implicit, but you need that to set it up that way. um but yeah, so you don't get the idea that they're seeing them as a class of people that that they really think that needs to be wiped out or whatever in these discussions. But it could be that they're coming up with ideas to explain that. Like, I think you see Aristotle sort of trying to come up with a Helleno-supremacist view that will work with natural categories that are in the natural world. They're definitely trying to do that. It's just how successful is problematic. It'll work for when you're going to set up a war against the Thracians or whatever, but once you bring them into your community and make them the slaves in the community, that argument doesn't seem to be working for them. They come up with some other really interesting ways of constructing people within their community as slaves, but and that might be part of it, but in general, yeah, I think it maps on, but not 100%. Like, it could be thinking of the Scythians being this nomadic group, that they are the group that then gets, you're going to compare the herders to them, like, so it's like multiple mirrors of like, well, these guys are nomadic wild people in the north, and yeah, monstrified in that way, but and good for wartime dehumanization that way. But as a persistent thing in their community, I think it's who they live with as slaves, right? And yeah, they could include Scythians, they could include all these different people, but it's that group, and so it's not about any particular ethnicity. I think it's just the category that they're in is they're slaves. So yeah, does that help?
It does. It's kind of like looking at how are we superior to every other person on the planet,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Inferior each in different ways.
Right.
And you can use that, as you say, if you're going to go to war, that's perfect. You got an excuse to go.
Right.
But you just use it for like why we should just, our way is right and their way is wrong.
Right. That's a little bit different because you're not able to pose your way unless you can show that they're imposing their way on them too. That's
Yeah, but
right.
Not necessarily
yeah. But if they're okay, we can look at them and say, yeah, they're strange and they're crazy, but we can go to war and get their stuff, and then okay. But if we're not forcing them to be like us, then it's not. It hasn't switched on as, I would say, it hasn't switched on as race yet, right? But when we go to war on them, yeah, we turned it on. It's race, right? Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Hi, I can't. Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for your talk. I found your discussion on Apollonius especially interesting, and I just have a brief question, a little follow-up on one of your comments. I'm wondering about the simile with the shepherds and or beekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
If you know, or if you notice that there is a meaningful difference there between those two, like a shepherd seen as a less noble profession as opposed to a beekeeper.
Well, I it might be in that like I haven't actually dug too deeply into it, but I think that given that it gets used like Virgil with his beekeeping, it's a science, right? Or it's a technology that that they would associate with intelligence, etc. Right? So I think that would be where it goes. But yeah, so I think he switches to beekeeping because it's a techne as opposed to herding. He doesn't see that as a techne. And so yeah, so I think that might be the reason he picks that particular opposition instead of he could have picked something else like shipbuilders or something, right? But but there's also an allusion to the swarm similes in the Iliad as well going on, right? So the idea of the others being like a swarm of bees is what he's trying to get at. And so that's the idea. Does that make sense? Like I definitely think he's chosen it for a reason, and my intuition tells me it's got to be because they considered it a techne, whereas herding, anybody can do it. You can send a little kid out there and he can do it. Yeah, so they might have seen it as closer to being just like wood cutting, shipbuilding, right, is the other simile that we saw earlier, right? So it's somebody's gonna do something with a techne. That's probably not what we're gonna compare the herders to, or we want to use the Argonauts to that, not shepherds. Yeah, does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
We have one chat question as to what
okay.
other mythological stories are good to read into to see a deeper understanding of race and monstrification.
Oh, I think a lot. Yeah. I definitely think like you could start with looking at the Hesiod, right? Like he's laying the groundwork for all of this monstrification, right? All the monsters that the myths draw from, they all refer back to Hesiod's monsters, right? So that would be one. But I would say all the Hercules stories for sure, because that's another part of this project. Because Hercules is a figure in this, is that Hercules is monster quests are allegories, of course, for colonization, Greek colonization, and wiping out the people that are originally there, etc. So, and Apollonius is engaged with that because how you treat the serpent that's guarding the golden thing that you need to get on your quest is indicative of Jason lets Medea put it to sleep, lets the local person who already has a relationship with that other group mollify them, right? And take the fleece. Whereas Heracles kills the serpent that's guarding the apples of the Hesperides. And then the nymphs, when the Argonauts show up, they're enraged, right? And they go on and about how horrible Heracles is. So I think Apollonius is talking about this Hercules myths as in that category. So that would be a good place too, where a lot of monsters, a lot of things to think about there. Perseus would be another one. Pretty much all of them, I think you could just go with that. Anywhere a hero and a monster engage, whether it's in a simile or whether it's in an actual literally, I think you could do that. So I would encourage those kinds of investigations.
Well, we have one more. How does, if at all, topography / land setting play into the monstrification dehumanization?
Well, in the Argonautica, I think there is the whole issue of like this. There's a reference going on, I think, to Ptolemaic imperial ambitions in that region. So you've got that sort of one way in which the geography maps onto the real world. That area, the Ptolemies have interest in, right? And so the actions of the Argonauts in that area are somehow connected to Ptolemaic imperial ambitions. And so monstrifying some people and not others is somehow relevant there. Also the geography in the book 4, where there's a lot of snakes, lots and lots of snakes in the desert there, right? That attack people. Like one of the Argonauts gets killed by the snakes that come out of the Gorgon's head, blood, that kind of stuff. So yeah, the geography as a place that's producing monsters, like this sort of which area of the world is most monsterification produces monsters, right? I think that's something to think about too. Like so North Africa is a monster place, right? And so is Colchis is a monster place that where you're gonna find monsters. So yeah, the edges of the world is where there's a lot of monsters living out there, and these are people presumably, right, that we don't understand and we don't acknowledge their humanity. So that's how I think about that. Monsterific.
Monsterific. And on that, I think we'll let our guest go. Thank her once again, and applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I just want to mention we have 2 more colloquia. Professor Patricia Kim has changed her date to Wednesday, November 11th at 3:30, and we have yet to have a title from her. And Professor Mary Farag on Wednesday, December 2nd at 3:30 also, and we're still awaiting for the title on that. But thank you, Professor Murray, for a wonderfully diverting afternoon and very informative. And we appreciate it very, very much.
Well, thank
you. Particularly, we hope that someday you can come with and be with us in person soon.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I would love it. Well, thank you guys so much. This was really great. Yeah. And and I liked your questions a lot. They make me think of what I have to add.
Okay, Lindsay, you may shut us down, but thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.